In 1987, in the small town of Horicon, Wisconsin, a family was terrorized by a bunk bed. Debbie and Alan Tallman and their 3 children were a typical, normal Midwestern family. They had 1 son and 2 younger daughters, and so they bought a second-hand store bunk bed for the 2 younger daughters for their room. The house they were living in they had bought the year before, and the home was only 4 years old and had 0 history of any sort of hauntings or strange happenings occurring in it. No deaths, no nothing, zip. That is, until they brought this bunk bed into their home. When that bunk bed was moved into the girls' room, strange and terrifying things began happening to the family. The youngest daughter could be heard talking and laughing in the middle of the night. Her parents thought that she was just waking up in the middle of the night and then getting up to play with her toys. But then one night she ran into her parents' bedroom, terrified about these voices that she was hearing. And she would ask her parents, "Don't you hear them? Don't you hear them?" She also told them about a witch that she would often see behind her bedroom door, and that she had a glow around her like there was a fire around her. And this little girl would talk very often about fire. Now, these strange events weren't just happening in the girls' room where the bunk bed was. It was happening all through the home. Now, one night, when the son was going to bed, he had a radio playing, which I guess would play through the night to help him go to sleep. I did the same thing as a kid. I had to have my radio playing to go to sleep. Now, this little boy was laying in bed and started to notice that the radio stations were starting to change. And when he looked at the radio, he noticed that the knobs were turning on their own. And the frequency indicator was going back and forth, moving across all the channels over and over again, all on its own. So of course he gets up and he goes to his parents' bedroom and tells them what's happening. And of course they didn't believe him, because that's how these stories usually go. So they sent him back to bed, and the radio kept changing stations all on its own. So this poor, terrified little boy gets up and tells his parents that the radio is continuing to move all on its own. And again, the parents don't believe him, and his dad now threatens to just take the radio away from him if he's going to play games like this. And then on another night, that little boy saw the witch, which was the apparition of an old woman who had a glow about her like fire. Now these events got stranger and started to affect the adults in the home. One night, Alan was down in the basement. He was building additional rooms down there and was doing some painting that night. And when his wife Debbie called him up for dinner, he put his paintbrush, brushed down into the bucket of paint, like one does. And when Alan returned back down to the basement after dinner, he found that his paintbrush had been turned upside down. The handle was sticking into the paint bucket. So after that night, a lot of activity started to pick up in the garage. The garage door could be heard opening throughout the day and through the night, and of course no one was opening it. And Alan felt particularly singled out by whatever this thing was when he was in the garage, like he was being watched the whole time. And he described it as shutting himself into a tomb. One night at 2 a.m., Alan was coming home from a late night shift at work. He pulled into the driveway and started walking towards the front door. And that's when he heard a strange sound coming from the garage. He described it as a really loud howling wind. But the rest of the outside was quiet everywhere else. There was no wind. Then he heard a voice call to him. "Come here." So Alan runs to the side of the garage, and of course there's nobody there. And when he came back to the front of the house, he started hearing that howling wind sound again, and a voice that kept calling out to him. "Come here. Come here." So when Alan turned around to face this voice again, he noticed a glowing coming from inside the garage. It looked like it was on fire. So Alan runs into the house. He drops his lunch pail on the floor by the front door, and then he runs back outside to see if the garage is actually on fire. But when he gets back outside, the garage is completely dark, and everything's quiet. So Alan goes back inside the house. He picks up the lunch pail that he had left on the floor, and as he's holding it, some sort of force grabs it from his hands and throws it across the room. This ghost is an asshole. Alan also started having horrifying visions of coming home and finding his family dead. He was just psychologically breaking down at this point. Now, Alan began sleeping in the girls' room on the floor because the girls were terrified to sleep in that room alone. He awoke in the middle of the night and noticed that a fog was starting to creep into the room. And standing in front of him was the apparition of the woman who glowed like fire. And she spoke to him, and she told him, "You're dead." Lady, you're dead. So why don't you just cut it out? So why don't you go be dead and awful somewhere else? And poor Alan spent the rest of the night freaked out and crying, and they had to call their church priest over to help calm him down. So the breaking point comes for this family in January of 1988. Alan had to spend a couple weeks doing night shifts at his job, so his nephew came to stay with his family, because obviously Alan did not want his family left alone at this point. So Alan's nephew was now sleeping on the floor in the girls' room, and Alan's nephew was a skeptic. He did not believe this family's stories at all about supernatural things happening in the home. That is, until this one special night. Because essentially the same thing happened to Alan's nephew. He awoke in the middle of the night, saw that there was a fog rolling across the bedroom, and when he looked up, there was the apparition of the old woman who glowed like fire standing in front of him. And needless to say, that he became hysterical. He got up and just started running around the house screaming, and this of course woke Deborah up. And at this point, she'd had enough. So she somehow gets the nephew to stop screaming and run back in the room to grab the kids, while Deborah starts packing bags for everyone, and they abandon the house. And it did not take long after that for word to spread about the haunted house in Horicon, Wisconsin. Reporters and curiosity seekers soon descended upon the town. But the Tallmans, being the religious-natured people that they were, they did not want to be associated with any sensationalized paranormal story. Sorry, guys. So 2 weeks after abandoning their home, the Tallmans had the bunk bed destroyed. It was demolished in a landfill and completely buried underneath the rubble and garbage. And from there on out, the Tallmans never had any encounter with the entity again. Their home was quiet again. I guess because of the trauma that the family went through in that home, they eventually sold the house and moved to another town. And the family that moved into the home after them never had any strange paranormal experiences there. And the Tallmans didn't have any problem in their new home. These strange paranormal experiences started and stopped with this second-hand bought bunk bed. Always be careful with what you pay for. And I hope that you all sleep snugly and warm in your non-cursed beds tonight. Let me show you my thrift store find today. Lisa Frank, 1993. Hopefully it's not cursed. Hopefully it is. I guess I'll find out.